Okay, afternoon everybody. Welcome to the Audit Committee. The first item on the agenda is the election of the chair for the 2020-21 municipal year. Could I have nominations, please?
Yeah. So I nominate Paula O'Connor, please.
Okay, and can I have a seconder for that?
I'll second that, Jeremy.
Okay, and any other nominations? All in favour?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody against? And any abstentions? Okay, thank you. Paula is absent today. She's given her apologies. So item 2 is the election of the vice chair for the 2020-21 municipal year. Could I have nominations, please?
I nominate Paxton Hood Williams.
Okay, can I have a seconder, please?
I second that. Terry Hennigan, second that.
Okay, any other nominations? And all in favour?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, anybody against? And any abstentions? Okay, Paxton, thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you to the Audit Committee for that. I assume it's not commiserations rather than anything else, but there we go. Anyway, thank you very much. I do appreciate it, and we'll move on to item 3 on the agenda. Apologies for absence.
Apologies from Paula O'Connor, Councillor Andrew Stevens, and from Jason Garcia.
Okay, and do we have any declarations of interest, I guess, as well?
Anything?
Any disclosures of personal interest?
I've got a personal interest as I'm a governor of Pentre Harvard School.
Yes, Chair, Governor of Pentre Harvard School and
Yeah.
member of the Port Authority. Agenda item 6 and appendix 3.
Yeah, that one. Yeah.
Okay, is that it? Item 5 of the minutes of first of all, for accuracy, page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, and page 5. Page 6, and page 7. If there's no concerns as far as the membership is concerned, could somebody propose it be accepted, please?
Okay, I can't.
Anybody want to propose that?
I'll propose it. Go on.
Thank you, Terry. Seconder.
Yeah, I'll second it. Yeah.
Get on like that. Get on with it.
Anybody against, I'm going to ask now, because that's probably easier than saying everybody for. Any abstentions? In that case, thank you very much. I don't know if anybody's read through them and picked up any matters arising. I must admit I didn't. I did have a good look through them, but if anybody's got any matters, please take this opportunity, so to say, at the moment. Okay, that moves us on to item 6. At this rate of progress, we'll be home in about 10 minutes. Oh, sorry, we are home already. I forgot that, didn't I? Anyway, Internal Audit Annual Plan 2021, monitoring report for the first period. For the period 1, for the period July 2020 to 30th September 2020. Over to you then, Simon. I think that's your report. I assume you're going to take us through that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Chair. This is the standard monitoring report for committee for quarter 2, covering the period of 1st of July to 30th September 2020. Basically outlines the work that's been undertaken by the team through that period in quarter 2. Just to give you some context, obviously the team are still having to deal with the pandemic conditions. They continue to work from home throughout the period. Similar to the quarter 1 report, so that is the background and context to the situation we're actually facing at the moment. We had hoped, as the restrictions started to be eased at the end of quarter 1, that we could possibly restart some site visits, particularly to primary schools, We had actually booked some appointments in to visit the primaries at that time, but obviously due to the current restrictions, those have been postponed indefinitely. So we're in the same situation really, where we attempted to complete all of our work remotely, either via Sims or team meetings, etc. So section 2 outlines the work with. So we've finalised 14 audits in the period, 10 of which had a high assurance rating and 4 had a substantial assurance rating. A total of 67 recommendations were made, and management agreed to implement all of the recommendations, as shown in table 2.4. We also certified one of the grants, the Children and Communities grant in section 2.6. And obviously you've received the school's annual report from Nick that was prepared in Q2 as well. Again, just to reiterate, we have had some difficulty initiating some reviews, primarily because staff are still at home. A lot of the sites are still closed. The primary schools had restricted access, and to protect the well-being of teams and communities, resisted doing any site visits to date. We've had one member of staff full-time seconded to the food bank initiative, who has now rejoined the team. And we've also been doing some more checking on the various support grant payments that have been paid out. Just to highlight to committee, sickness levels was slightly higher in Q2 than in the previous quarter, as shown in 2.14. As at the end of the quarter, there's a total of 76 days to date. Luckily, none of that was COVID related, and one of the members of staff is now back in the office. One member is still off on long-term absence, unfortunately, and is being supported by our occupational health teams. Basically, so if we just scroll through to section 3, the follow-ups that were completed in the quarter included concessionary fares. Again, we had a positive result there where all the recommendations have been fully implemented. And fleet maintenance, if members remember, we had an attendee at one of the in-person meetings recently to give an update on that report, as it was a moderate. And the committee asked for the possibility of retrospective check-in being introduced as a control. I'm pleased to confirm that has now been introduced in that department. So there is a compensated control which covers the usage of equipment and materials for that area. The second follow-up of the DBS service was underway at the time of writing the report, so I'll have to report that back at a subsequent meeting. And also, obviously, due to access restrictions, we were unable to do the Cwmglas and Pen y Bryn second follow-ups. They are due whenever we can regain access to those sites. So if we just go to the appendices, Appendix 1 on page 14 outlines the orders that were finalised in the quarter. Appendix 2 gives a summary scope of the reviews that were completed in that quarter. And then Appendix 3 is a snapshot of where we are in terms of plan completion at the end of September. Just wanted to highlight, obviously, because we might be struggling at some point to complete the full plan due to access restrictions. As I reiterated in Q1, that we are placing most importance on the fundamental systems. So if you look at section 2 in Appendix 3, which highlights the fundamental audits to give section 151 assurances. We've got Treasury management, accounts payable, cash, accounts receivable, council tax, main accounting, and NNDR. I'm pleased to say we've managed to finalise some of those already. Some are normally due in Q3, Q4, and some are obviously in progress at the moment. So I'm fairly confident that we can get the key systems completed to provide some assurance in those key areas by year end. And obviously we will keep the situation under review for the rest of the plan, and I'll report back to committee any concerns as and when I need to. So that's the first report, Chair. If I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Anybody want to put their hands up to ask any questions? Leslie?
Just a couple of observations. Pleased that the disclosure and debarring service is still ongoing, so we'll find out about that later. And just really to add my thanks to the team, because I would guess that the situation you've been working under for months has not exactly been easy. So I think, all things considered, this report isn't at all bad. I think it could have been a lot worse. So please pass my thanks back to the team. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tracy. Happy to pass that back to the team. And as you say, it's been very challenging for the team over the period. There was a glimmer of hope come towards the end of Q1 where we were hoping to maybe revisit. But obviously things have deteriorated, as we all know, and unfortunately we'll just have to keep it under review for the foreseeable. But as I said, we are trying to prioritise the key areas, and particularly just to let members aware in terms of school coverage, because obviously that
Yes, please.
make up a large part of the actual plan. We have tried to mitigate that risk by doing a different audit. So we've done a general audit of all procurement across primary schools, all procurement across comprehensive schools, as that is probably the key area that members have concerns over. We've also proposed to do another audit of the unofficial funds or school funds in the near future, because I know that is another possible risk area. So even though we might not be able to visit all of the schools in the year, we will be covering off the risk and provide some assurance over the key risk areas to members and to 151 officers.
Okay, Jeff, you had a question?
Yeah, I mirror what Councillor Walton actually said. It must be extremely difficult. You know, with the audit, shall we say, not the schools now, the waste management parks and so on, the audits you carried out, were they different to what was actually planned? Have you had to tailor your audit really in line with the restriction?
Thanks, Jeff. Not really. The programmes that we've got in place haven't really been changed to a certain amount. And if there is that situation, I'll have to put a caveat in the report to make sure that's made apparent in the actual review. What we've managed to do with those that have been completed to date, the majority have actually held all of their documentation and records electronically. So instead of us having to visit the site, some sites are more up to speed with electronic record keeping, spreadsheets, etc. than others. And those that we've actually managed to complete have actually been able to provide that information remotely. So, in terms of the actual coverage and scope of the review, that's not been changed. As you can see in Appendix 2 of the report, the general scope has remained untouched, really, and they've just been more accommodating in what information they can provide.
Yeah, and actually going on from there, the, shall we say, page 16, of course, the old problems with procurement are raising their heads again. A bit disappointing, really, with some of the comments there. Why is it actually, I feel it's gone a little bit backwards there,
Yeah, just to give members an update on procurement in particular, we have done a generic procurement audit across all of the primaries that were due to be audited this year, I just mentioned. Some of the outcomes of that is that obviously the CPRs have recently been amended. And some of the recommendations we've made is that a training regime is put back in place for the primary schools to reiterate that message and to get them back on board with the contract procedure rules and procurement guidelines. So we are aware that there are issues there, as is education and procurement. And I'm hoping, obviously, when things are relaxed slightly, that we can reinitiate the training regime for those areas. Because obviously it's been a while since we've done the training the last time. And we have seen possibly a new intake of staff within the primaries and comprehensives. So it is part of that recommendation that we restart that training and that message back to the schools.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, anybody else got any questions? Could you put your hands up if you do, please, and then I can see them on the screen. Mike?
Yes, in regards to the point Jeff made, is it possible, might help you, Simon, that perhaps the schools can put an actual procurement policy in place along with their other policies, so they got that sort of matrix and to advise them what is needed, so that can be built into the school policy. So if there are sort of any grey areas, at least it's included within that policy. Just a thought might help the schools, and might help yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. We might pick that up when we do the training with the schools. I know the School Funding Information Unit and Kelly's team will probably, I'm happy to take that message back to them. Just obviously they are aware that they have to abide by the scheme of finance for schools and our corporate CPRs. So I mean, I'm happy to ask Kelly to include maybe that in part of her training package to, as a checklist really, as a check for them to make sure they've got something in place.
Okay, thanks, Simon. Any other questions? Obviously, in that case, then what Leslie has already said and Jeff has added to as well is our thanks to the department. Obviously, it's difficult times for you, and from the impression I got from what you were saying, that the COVID has had a minimum impact, particularly at this point in time, but we'll have to look at it closely towards the end of the year and see what's there and what needs carrying over, etc., I guess.
Yeah,
so anyway, thank you very much for that, and we'll move on to the next item on the agenda, item 7, which is the recommendation tracking report.
Yeah, that's me again. Thanks, Chair. As members are aware, this is just our reporting of the follow-up outcomes for the standard audits that have had a high, substantial or standard audit reports. This isn't included in the fundamentals because they are followed up separately with the recommendation tracker, which is underway at the moment. I'll come back to members in the near future. So Appendix 1 basically gives us the outcome of the follow-up work that was completed by our audit assistant in the quarter. And I'll scroll down to the bottom on page, bear with me. I can't see the page number, the second page of the appendices, page 29, sorry.
29.
As you can see, yeah, 148 recommendations were made, and of those 141 were confirmed as being implemented as part of the follow-up work in quarter 2, which represents a 95.3% implementation rate. There's further detail in Appendix 2 of those recommendations that hadn't been implemented when we did the follow-up exercise. And as you can see, the majority of them are in relation to restrictions that are in place due to COVID. There was one that wasn't due to be implemented at the time we did the follow-up, but the remainder were all not implemented due to issues with COVID, access restrictions, inventory and reconciliations and that sort of thing, which is obviously outside of the department's control. Again, if you notice, none of them are high risk recommendations. They're all substantial or low risk or good practice. Sorry, and there's one medium, but I mean nothing to raise alarm bells.
Anybody got any questions on that though for Simon? When I went through this report, looking at it, my impression was certainly that in terms of the recommendations, apart from the fact where you haven't been able to get them finalised because of COVID, and everything has been done. So basically, once the schools have the opportunity to do that with the governors' meetings, and I'm sure that those are going to disappear as well. So basically, that would become a 100% report as I see it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So thank you for that. In that case, unless anybody's got anything else to say, I'll move on to item 8. I don't know, Ben, whether you want to take these together, 8, 9, 10 and 11. They're all yours. I don't know which way you want to play it, or do you want to do them one by one?
Thank you, Chair. I think you're right. They're all just for information, but probably worth doing the first one in isolation because it's relatively current and probably the one that's got the most interest. And then the others are more sort of old news stories. So if you're okay with that, Chair, I'll do the first one in isolation and then wrap up the other 3.
Yeah, that's
so
fine.
on this report, I'm not going to repeat what's in the report. The report itself is fairly self-evident and is for information. For committee's purposes, I will just repeat what I said at Cabinet, which is this assures you as an audit committee that I'm still delivering the strategic control at that sort of microscopic level, if you get it, in terms of individual heads of services reporting up through their PFM processes, ultimately to inform the first quarter. But the messaging and the reporting was as much about the macro position for first quarter. As I indicated to Cabinet, it was deferred a month later to await some firming up on a number of Welsh Government pots of money to access. I'm acutely conscious that some members have expressed concerns in the past about the reliance on specific grants. This one was particularly held up because a number of these offers are not specific grants in the true sense, i.e. there's not an offer letter and a sum of money certain. These are what I would say in the vernacular more of a beauty parade where you're bidding with 21 other authorities and the most deserving cases get a share of the money, so it's necessarily slowed it down a bit. The report clearly sets out substantial service overspending before a number of central decisions that I recommended to Cabinet to approve. That includes ultimately making a number of environment arrangements because they bust all of my environment limits because the budget has been flexed by over £100 million. Sets out normal assumptions and arrangements in terms of restricting spend otherwise, but also committing to spending the monies brought forward from last year in the contingency fund, and also setting aside up to £10 million potentially of use of earmarked reserves to cover off the current year position. And I am due to report to council in November on my strategic review of reserves. So I think that's all I need to say, that in terms of for committee's purposes, they are assured it's both working at micro and macro level, but there may well be some questions on this report given that it's very fresh and very, very current, and everyone is somewhat uncertain as to their overall position finance wise, not only in the public sector but in the wider private sector, with a whole raft of recent ministerial announcements, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Has anybody got any questions then for Ben? Jeff?
Yeah, thanks. There's quite a lot of information, and as you say, things are changing all the time. Sorry, on page 39, the revenue budget summary, I can see a shortfall of £2.5 million there in the council tax collection. I know money's actually come in from Welsh Government, but I think it was the last council meeting, I asked for a figure. I think it was 4.7 million then. So, what is the actual shortfall for council tax at the present time? And has that been offset by any monies from Welsh Government yet?
So in terms of clarifying that one, I think you asked at the last scrutiny, Councillor Jones, and I confirmed that it was about £5 million of outstanding arrears in relation to the 1920 year. And I also provided some written notes in terms of arrears from previous years, because as you're aware, we pursue all arrears until absolutely all avenues are exhausted. And that's the normal point at which we report in year on a position. This figure quoted in the report for the first quarter is an estimate of a £2.5 million loss on collection fund at the end of this year, 2021. We don't normally report in year because it's very, very uncertain. Until we've collected, until we've chased and exhausted all opportunities, I don't normally routinely report an estimated loss on the collection fund, albeit sharp observers will have noticed that 2 years ago in the outturn I reported a near £400,000 loss on the collection fund. I did, as part of the outturn report, indicate that that was nearer £800,000 with just a week of COVID lockdown at the end of 1920. And so there is an inevitability to some extent in my mind that there will be a seven-figure loss on collection in the current year. My latest estimate was £2.5 million in the current year. Across Wales, the authorities have indicated they're estimating about £32 million. So on that basis, we are where we'd expect to be in terms of our 7.5% share. We won't know until we get to year end and until the collection fund is drawn and the overall deficit established. Some of you may have seen media reporting around arrangements with SIPFA and the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government about deferring the losses and spreading it over future years. For the avoidance of doubt, that only applies in England. There are different accounting arrangements, both under the Accounting Code of Practice and legislatively in Wales. Losses on collection crystallise in year. Authorities have set out their assumptions and estimates to Welsh Government. Welsh Government have made some arrangements for reimbursing us for council tax reduction scheme costs. I think suffice to say there is no certainty on any recompense at the moment for council tax losses, other than we are advised by officials. Ministers are sympathetic, but it's one of a long list of things that's in the mix and for which at the moment we've not had any relief. And it's a difficult one ultimately. Council tax is a local tax paid for by local people. And whilst it's not entirely of our making COVID, the reality is the losses do crystallise locally. So I think that's one that's got quite a lot of policy implications and debates to happen at levels way above just the local scenario. And that's the reason for referencing that figure in there, Councillor Jones. It's my best estimate at this point in time. It could go higher, it could go lower. I would still expect it to be a seven-figure sum unless the Welsh Government is in a position to meet some of the collection losses in year. But that's for much debate still to come.
Sorry, Paxton, can I just go on as well? Going back to page 35, I think there's an estimated overspend for the year of 31 million, and I think it's actually put down entirely to COVID-19. So again, really, with regards to any monies coming back, that's not been eaten away as yet. I know you've actually said we've had 10 million, I think, and I think there was 200 odd million pounds that actually went to local authorities. Is that 31 million after the monies we've received, or?
For the avoidance of doubt, the £31 million is before the receipt of any monies. Again, what I'm trying to do is capture both the microscopic level of service overspending against the budget that was set. On that basis, it's clearly £31 million. We had £10 million in the bag and another £2 million coming. So effectively, one of the recommendations in this report unusually was an ask to wire all the sums for all the pots of money already physically received in cash from Welsh Government into service departments. So what will happen is in the second quarter, you'll see those overspends come down for a standing still position because money will have been wired into those budgets. Ordinarily, I do the virements myself under delegated powers, but the sheer size of the budget flexing means I needed Cabinet's approval to wire them. Whilst I've said that those overspends come down, it is also the case that in the second quarter, I'm anticipating further new areas of overspending and further bids against Welsh Government for recompense from the subsequent pots of money, including the 200 million you've referred to, Councillor Jones. The reality is because it's a competitive process against all other authorities and it's done on a stepwise basis, it can take up to 3 months to get certainty of cash back. That just adds to the uncertainty. So it probably will mean that it'll overstate the position for the council as a whole in isolation each quarter, but I think it provides a more transparent position of what services would be in if it were not for the recovery of those sums of money. And it is just as a product of waiting for big buckets of cash to come in and then deciding to reallocate them out on a reasonable and proportionate basis, because we don't have certainty as to which ones we're going to get. It's the point I made at the beginning. I think it's Councillor Paxton Hood-Williams who's previously asked it around, relying on specific grants. It's useful to know what the ebb and flow is here, because whilst we're okay for this year on the basis of the projections I've made, the overall ability for UK government, Welsh government or ourselves to finance the ongoing impact of COVID is probably the thing that weighs on me most heavily. As much as we'll have a budget cycle and budget process to go through in terms of setting a budget in normal times, it's what happens in that intervening period, just soon after the budget is set and in the early period of next year, where on the basis of where we're at, I'm still expecting there to be quite a lot of uncertainty day to day. But as you'll be aware, we've got to legally have gone through a process of open public consultation, proposed a budget and set it by no later than the 11th of March to council. So it's a deliberate presenting of it two different ways to try and give a macro position, but also continue our normal approach, which you would expect to see in terms of me holding the individual directors to account through the PFM process.
Okay, Peter Jones.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, can I apologise for arriving 10 minutes or so late to this meeting. I had considerable difficulty fighting my machine to get into Teams, but I made it eventually, so here I am. In terms of my point, in relation to Agenda Item A and the Budget Monitoring Report, with reference to, I think it's paragraph 2.8 on the bottom of page 36, my concern is with reference to existing commitments that were made in the budget for 2020-21. And there's a reference there at the bottom of the final bullet point in 2.8 to existing agreed budget and political priorities, and therefore nonetheless limit service overspending, etc. Where there is I'm sorry if this sounds like a naive question, and I apologise if it is naive, but if there is a commitment in the 2021 budget to a particular expenditure, and I've got one or two in mind to do with the natural environment, and those in effect are agreed budget and political, stress the word political, priorities, are they safe or are they subject to delay or cancellation in view of the overall COVID effect on the budget? Thank you.
And that is very much the reason why I deliberately chose the wording I did, Councillor Jones, because I'll be honest and frank, there is a tension. The budget has been set, approved by council, and members and officers must implement the budget as approved. So the positive part of the answer is they're safe in that sense, because no one should do other than implement the will of council. But our council's financial procedure rules, our constitution is unchanged. There's no special get out of jail free card as a result of COVID. So the rules say that every director and every head of service must contain their spend. So there is a tension in terms of judging when to slow the pace of spend, when to implement, but clearly it's a shot across bows to indicate that members take precedence here. Council expressed a view in terms of a majority view for the budget being voted through, and officers must implement it, but they must also strive to not overspend. Now, the reality is on the scale of the reported overspending, and given I've indicated I'm likely to come to council asking for a draw from earmarked reserves, I have accepted in extremis, in the exceptional circumstances, that an overspend will occur. So it's my way of trying to remind all parties of all obligations. So there's a deliberate wordiness in that phrasing, Councillor Jones. I hope that gives you some assurance, but it equally draws my colleagues' attention to they must redouble their efforts to try and minimise the overspend, because if they minimise the overspend, that's less draw from reserves and gives us more chance to continue and address setting the budget for next year.
Thank you, Ben. I mean, I understand the answer, and the particular items in question that I'm concerned about, I shall have to try to ensure survive. But it is effectively, it's a situation in which we have budgeted spend, and it was a budget that was set within the income limits, and therefore all other things being equal, which of course they haven't been, would have worked. But effectively, budgeted spend can now become an overspend. Is that correct?
That is correct, and that's the reason for that phrasing. However, you should also take assurance that if any officer was ultimately proposing to materially deviate from what council agreed as specific new sums as part of a proposal to contain overall spending, they should be drawing that to your attention as individual, those of you that are cabinet members or on individual committees or got a particular lead or championing role, and should also ultimately be flagging that up in future monitoring reports. So the second quarter report, if hypothetically a director was proposing that one of those specific agreed sums, which had the full will and support of the majority of council when the budget was set, they should be drawing attention if they were proposing not to implement. So I think that gives you probably even more comfort on my second answer than the first. And that's the way those of you that are interested in those proposals should continue to be interested, and you should be kept appraised of if there were any intent to not implement what were very specific proposals in a number of targeted areas. And I know specifically the ones you're particularly referring to, Councillor Jones. And of course, many of those were to address equal legal obligations on us with due regard to future generations, and also the Environmental Act. And none of the laws have gone away. So hence, again, that's the reason for the combination of words. The law is still the law in all obligations, and officers and members are due to implement council budgets as approved.
Thank you, Ben. I'm very reassured by your answer. Thank you.
Anybody else got any other questions for Ben on this one at the moment? If not, in that case, I will just say that obviously, and it goes without saying, I suppose, that we are in strange times as far as budgets are concerned and spends, etc. We really don't know at this point in time where we're going to finish up. It is difficult, but at the end of the day, the only people who can make those decisions for change, I think, Mr. Smith, basically are either cabinet or full council. So that's the ones that we have to abide by, I guess. But it's going to be interesting to watch this through and follow it through and see where we finish up at the end of the day. Obviously going to be a difficult time, but it's going to be very interesting. Okay, in that case, I will move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the revenue outturn and savings tracker.
So on these, Chair, with your permission, I'm going to bundle all three together, because although they're some of them are disparate, some of them are related. They're older news. The outturn is for noting you've already received the statement of accounts. It's already gone through council and been certified. So it is a matter of record and identifying and reporting on the very substantial underspend that was achieved for last year and has stood us in good stead and is referenced in the first quarter monitoring report. So I don't think I need to say anything else on the outturn report in itself. The Treasury Management Policy Statement, the Treasury Management Statement has already been to Council, and just for the avoidance of doubt, I will reiterate, given you've got the duty to hold me to account, I will repeat what I said at Council, which is I reported that I exercise all matters on your behalf finance-wise under delegation, and I complied with all matters in year. That's the bit that you need the assurance on, so I don't think I need to labour the point any further. And then the third item was a press release and associated report, if any of you clicked any further down, to Audit Wales Financial Resilience Report and Sustainability Report, with some identified figures for each of the individual authorities. There are no surprises in there for Swansea. There's a table in that report that indicates overall the 22 authorities added £26 million to reserves, and it's suffice to say that the single biggest authority that added the most to reserves was Swansea, which undoubtedly improved our financial resilience. It also has a league table of who's got the most reserves and bits like that, so we've gone significantly up the table. The rest of the report, with the greatest of respect to my Audit Wales colleagues and the Auditor General, makes some pretty obvious statements that authorities hold reserves. Some have spent reserves, some have added to reserves, and they're in for a jolly interesting, uncertain time, and their ability to withstand it, we'll all wait and see what happens, and there will be follow-up work. I paraphrase slightly for effect, but you'd be surprised if the Auditor General didn't conclude that authorities are in different shapes. They've gone into COVID in different shapes, and they're pretty certain to come out of COVID in different shapes. So I don't think I need to particularly say anything on any of them, but I'm more than happy to answer questions if there are any on the individual reports, given they're only for information, Chair.
Leslie, you wanted to ask a question?
More of a comment on the Welsh Audit Office press release. I had a slight wry smile at the way it was suggesting that it was going to give suggestions to councils how they could be more efficient and more commercially aware and all the rest of it. And it did occur to me, what do they think councils have been doing for about the last 10 years, if not trying to improve efficiency, effectiveness, making money go further? I mean, I suppose they've got to say it, they're the audit office, but I did just sort of thought, you are telling us, I mean, you said yourself that they're slightly telling you something that you probably do know about already, but I suppose they're just crossing the T's and dotting the I's, maybe, to be kind to them. But there you go.
Okay. Do you want to come back on that, Ben?
No, I think I'm happy to treat that as a statement rather than to pass any further comment on, but I think you can work out that my views are very similar to Councillor Walton's on that, but I'll say no more in terms of officially responding, if you don't mind on that one.
Terry, you're looking as if you want to say something. Well, perhaps not. Can I ask a question, Treasury management question, just to show my lack of understanding again, just for a change? Obviously, you're borrowing cash at the moment with the PWLB at about 2%. And obviously, we're borrowing a lot of money at the moment. Just a quickie in the sense that couldn't we get lower interest rates on the open market? And if so, why don't we go that way?
At this point in time, the PWLB still remains relatively attractive in terms of long-term borrowing. Whilst you see headline rates, what's available to us for 50-year money with certainty, the PWLB is still relatively attractive. But equally, you've got to remember that 1% pesky premium is still on PWLB rates. So I'm waiting for the consultation by UK Government and HM Treasury to end, and we revert back to a position where I can borrow 1% less than the current rates, i.e. go even lower than 2%, down to 1%, 1.5%. And of course, many members will recall that the first £90 million worth of borrowing I did precisely before that premium came in. And so whilst we came into COVID with relatively strong cash balances, as the Treasury policy report itself stated, and as I updated to Council, it's been a relatively quiet year and I've sat on the sidelines. I'm waiting for that premium to drop out because there are legitimate areas of capital spend. Council agreed a very substantial Band B schools programme and is halfway through. It's substantial city centre regeneration, and that stuff will have to be gotten away at some point in terms of borrowing. But there was a deliberate ploy on my part, having filled my boots at a particularly opportune time, to sit on the sidelines and wait for it to be an even more opportune time in due course to cement in ultimately those rates. And I have made quite clear my strategy that given that these are long-term assets, I think I am discharging my fiduciary duties to whole council plus taxpayers, and having due regard to the well-being of future generations by trying to get those loans as long as possible, given that these are long-term assets that are being built. So that's the reason for it being the position as it is in terms of the report, and also the longer-term strategy. Councillor Paxton Hood Williams.
Can I just go to page 90 a minute, which is the list of counterparty, I suppose, people that we invest with, and we've got 66 2/3 of that money based with two local authorities, effectively. Or Bank of Scotland is not as a bank, I agree, but certainly we've got 22,000 with another council. You have to be pretty satisfied of the security of that, don't you, before you would put that amount of money into a local authority investment?
Local authorities, I continue to form part of the brotherhood and sisterhood of all local authority treasurers, which is to consider that all local authorities are equal, despite any comments that might be passed on their individual positions. Don't forget the uniqueness of local government and local authorities. Ultimately, the budget must be balanced, and any shortfall falls on the relative Section 151 officer to ensure that it is balanced, and that includes any shortfall falling on other taxpayers. No local authority has ever defaulted on a loan between itself. My own view is that if any authority got into that position, clearly there are heightened risks, given everyone looks nervously at where everyone is and will everyone come out of COVID as unscathed as others. But I equally think it extremely unlikely that the commissioners of what was previously called the PWLB, and we still call it the PWLB, the Public Works Loans Board, because it still really is that, even though it technically doesn't exist in its original format. I could see no circumstance in which one authority would be in a position where it would be allowed to default either professionally or technically or through the Treasury, because you'd otherwise have contagion through the local authority sector. So I consider all local authorities equal, irrespective of the sums that they're in the market for. You do get concentrations because different authorities have different strategies. I've just said what mine is. We are doing substantial long-term capital asset building, which councillors agreed, and for which I must fund a financing solution, and I'm borrowing long-term. Thurrock in particular has a short-term borrowing strategy. It's taking advantage of lower interest rates in the short term and borrowing short-term repeatedly. I pass no view on their treasurer's strategy as opposed to my own, other than to say we have completely opposite strategies, and for any deal in a money market you need a counterparty. So they're in the market for short-term money often. I'm looking to place money until I've spent the capital programme. So it ends up being a natural fit, and so it's no surprise that you end up with some clustering around a number of authorities. There would be no point me trying to seek to do a deal with another authority that was borrowing long from the PWLB, because they'd have no need to access this authority's money. So yes, there is a concentration, but I treat all authorities equally, and I see no default risk on any one authority in isolation. Frankly, they're all as much at risk or not as at risk as others, and that fundamental underpin from taxpayers is the thing that gives me assurance professionally, reputation, and I think every other treasurer in the land would say the same thing.
Yeah, understand what you're saying now because of the situation that we're in terms of councils, but obviously I'm thinking back to about 2008, 2010, when there was a crash, and a lot of people did get their fingers burnt. A lot of councils got their fingers burnt at that time, but you're quite happy with what you got there in that sense.
Just to clarify, Chair, I mean, yes, there were councils that got their fingers burnt with other counterparties. Let's be brutally honest. We are deemed to be a major player. We are deemed not to be naive and are making our own professionally informed decisions. I would still take comfort from our counterparty being a local authority than a financial institution, where there are, if a financial institution got into difficulty, there are different regulatory regimes. And you're right, there have been other reasons why some authorities have got themselves into difficulties, particularly where they've chased a particularly attractive rate. But I don't think they apply in this case, notwithstanding the general risks of COVID and authorities being potentially coming out of COVID in different relative strengths.
Okay, Ben, thank you very much for that. And you've got your hand up again, Jeff. Do you want to come back in?
Chair, I got my hand up as well.
I know, I had noticed, Mike. I'll come back to you afterwards now.
Yeah, with regards to, borrowings and so on, I must admit it reminded me, I'm sorry I'm going to have to go back quite a few pages, but on page 68. It's the, you know, the outturn, the capital financing charges. The outturn, well, the budget was 32 million and the outturn was 24. But on page 43, it seems to have gone up to 36 million. Now, I know we've got the MRP actually in place. I would have thought that it wouldn't be 36 million, then the MRP would have reduced this year. Why such a large increase? That's page 68.1 and page 43.
Yes, apologies. I'm taking a bit of time.
No, I'm
having my own IT problems, flitting between the items. Yeah, the budget is set to be consistent with the medium-term financial plan, which is that ultimately I will be borrowing substantial additional sums of capital through unsupported borrowing, which are an interest payment. You'll be aware the MRP payment is only payable in the year following you drawing down the loan. Right. So the budget was set on the basis that I would be continuing to externalise debt. As a result of COVID, there has been a delay in the consultation on that 1% premium on the PWLB. Mm-hmm. I am currently blocked out of the market because it would be foolish of me to borrow knowingly 1% more than I could as soon as that restriction comes off. So I have been drawing down, as you can see in the Treasury policy statement, we came in with over £100 million or around £100 million worth of cash. And as we go through this year, you'll see that cash starting to draw down quite significantly. That buys me time. So although the budget is continuing to increase, because don't forget, longer term, the budget for capital financing through to 25-26 is meant to grow from 30 to 45 million pounds, as I set out fully to council when Cabinet and Council made its decisions on its long-term investment strategy for the capital programme. But in the very short term, both the combination of the MRP review short-term savings and the lack of having to go out and externalise and borrow that debt, which saves me a further sum on MRP and saves me a further sum on interest, because even at interest rates of 2.5% or post the PWLB premium of 1.5%, it is still cheaper to borrow from my own cash-backed reserves, where I'm lucky if I can get 0.5%. So you get the interplay of all of them, which results in an outturn that reports an underspend on capital financing, which has been added to the capital equalisation reserves and buys me a bigger buffer to get me to that glide path through to 25-26. So I do appreciate it's relatively complex a set of interplays, and it might seem a bit perverse that the outturn says the budget's gone, you know, the outturn is lower than the budget, but the budget is going up. But this is all to get it through to 25-26. If I didn't do it in a logical stepwise basis informed by the planned capital programme, you would get a cliff edge effect or an accelerator effect where I'd go from low figure, low figure, low figure to absolutely enormous figure. And I'm not prepared to allow that to happen. My duty is to taxpayers in the longer term and have due regard to the well-being of future generations. And so that's why the escalator is built in to get us to that peak position in 25-26. You will see in the short term the perversity of underspending on capital financing and a bit going into reserves, which makes it easier for me to smooth the glide path. And of course, in the very short term, whilst responding to COVID, I've been able to borrow the cash once to build the field hospital, get that reimbursed. And in the first quarter report, I'm proposing to borrow £10 million worth of cash again to support the forecast in the current year. So it does have some flexibility having that reserve in place.
Okay, thank you.
Mike, the airwaves are yours.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it's just to ask Ben, clearly, as you know, it was mentioned the PWLB board, the 1% was obviously sneaked in through the back door by the Treasury, you know. But I think you've been very, very wise and cautious, Ben, by going in early before that coming into effect. But it could well be, perhaps, Ben, I don't know if that's correct, if they might perhaps next time look to perhaps increase it from 1 to 2%, and then whoever is in that scheme is going to be clobbered even more. But I think the main thing is that we don't invest our money in Iceland.
I think on the latter point, I think that's exactly where the chair was asking previously. And as you can see, the counterparties I've got are nowhere near Iceland or other countries that are available. Those that look like foreign institutions are fully domiciled with a UK, they're UK subsidiaries with a full UK banking license for the ones that are financial institutions. In terms of the risk on the premium, the 1% premium was put in because a number of authorities were felt by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government to be somewhat exuberant in their borrowing strategies, and you ended up with very, very small councils having capital programmes hundreds of times the size of the council. And so it was put in as a blunt tool to choke off anyone being sane. It was insanity for anyone to then be effectively borrowing from the PWLB. I think the premium will come off. There is no risk of it going higher still, because the communities and local government have agreed with SIPFA, my professional body, that there is a binding code of practice on us to make sure that no treasurer decided to liberally interpret the rules to go on such an extreme spree again. And I do see the comments for the avoidance of doubt, given this is recorded, I meant only Iceland, the country, and other countries are available in the same way that other frozen food supermarkets are available.
Yes, okay. I'm not going to go further down that route, because those jokes will freeze if we're not careful. So I'm not going that far. Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions before I close this item? Except to say to Ben, 3 or 4 items there. Thank you very much for what you have to say and the explanations you get. It always seems to me that you're remarkably clear, and I wish I could understand half of what you're saying, irrespective of that. Anyway, thank you very much. And we'll move on. Pardon? We'll move on to
carry on.
We'll move on to item 12. Jeremy, do you want to take us through this?
Nothing really to add, Chair, to the written report. There's a few of the actions have been completed, as you can see in the written report, and a few have been updated. So if anybody got any questions.
Anybody got any questions?
Chair, it's not a question, but I'd like to intervene. Whilst the report is the report, Appendix 2, the very last action tracker, which is around the risk register, I did undertake with Paula O'Connor to flag up and remind members that a full update report is due to come to the next cycle of the Audit Committee, and I'm sure all members of the Audit Committee will be extremely interested in the level of progress that's been made on that, given the number of comments that have been expressed previously. So I did undertake just to raise that in her absence, because I know it's one that the now newly elected chair and you covering in her absence today, and all committee members have indicated their concerns of that. So I'm sure all committee members will be looking forward to a substantial update on that for next time.
Yes, I was going to say on the next item, in fact, our next meeting is in November, and there is purely one item on the agenda as far as I could see, and that was the mid-year 2021 overview of risk, and that's what we'll be looking at next month. Anybody got anything to say on items 12 or 13? In that case, I will say thank you very much for your attendance, and I'll bring the meeting to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Bye.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Chair.